online. We're going to have some polling questions as well, hopefully through the process, to get your feedback in terms of where you are in the journey, and equally how and what kind of help you require in terms of moving along in that process. But I'm joined today so far by Matt Croucher, who's EV Services Director at Liberty Charge, and Anthony O'Keefe, who is a planning transport planner from Islington. And hopefully we're going to get joined by Mark from Stockport, but we'll keep our fingers crossed that he'll be able to join us very, very soon and give us his perspectives as well. So firstly, I want to welcome my panelists to the session, and thank you very much, Anthony and Matt, for joining today and talking about, I think, what is probably the most important aspect of our journey in terms of the EV charging deployment, and that whole question about what is that strategy and how do we get local authorities moving along in the journey there. So I think I'm going to start off. Well, I was going to ask Mark a few questions, but he's not with us. So instead, I think I'll come to you, Anthony, as a starting point. I know in Islington you've deployed an awful lot of EV charging points. I guess for the team and everyone who's on the call today, whereabouts are you on that journey? How far have you got? And I guess maybe what are some of the key challenges that you've faced along that way in terms of putting your strategy together and getting that, I guess, approved?
Sure, thank you. So I joined, just to set the background, I joined Islington about a year ago, just over a year ago, and inherited work which my predecessor had done, which had taken us to having delivered about 280 charge points across the borough, rapids and lamp column charge points and fast charge points. The borough aims to have 500 charge points across the borough by the end of March 2023. And we're just under 400 at the moment. So with next batches coming through over the next number of months. In terms of the challenges, fundamentally it takes time. That's one of the biggest issues we've got. The time to ensure we've done the consultation, engagement, identification in terms of working out where the right charge points go at the right places. The actual consultation formal consent process, if you wish, and then organizing to just deliver. That is something has always been a challenge with limited resources. And I think like any authority, we have got constraints on the resources. So we find ourselves juggling quite a few plates at the same time. That said, we have very good cooperation with our charge point operators, good engagement with them. In terms of the borough's political position, it's strongly in favour of supporting EV drivers to move to using electric vehicles in the borough. And so there is a strong political strength behind it as well. So that's been helpful overall.
And just picking up on that point, Anthony, obviously the political will has got to be there from top to bottom, really, hasn't it? And I think yes. Certainly something that we see when we speak to local authorities is for those that may have done not much in this area, where they do get pushback from residents specifically about specific charging locations that may have been identified. That political will becomes really important, doesn't it, to make sure that actually, there is a clear view and a communication with residents in terms of actually this is why this charging infrastructure is so important. Matt, kind of bringing you in on that point and the whole importance of having a very clear EV charging strategy as the starting point of this journey. What are some of the key considerations that in your conversations with local authorities are really key for people to bear in mind?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Afternoon, everyone. So I've spent the past kind of it's nearly 13 years now working in the EV sector in a consultancy capacity until very recently, where I've joined a charge point operator, Liberty Charge. So it's quite interesting seeing kind of both perspectives. And a lot of the work I've been doing over the past 13 years prior to joining Liberty Charge was around advising local authorities all across the country around the development of an EV strategy, and over that time and kind of hearing the experiences and requirements really from the local authority perspective, had a bit of a kind of stage gate process of different steps that emerged that we tended to feel were key to deriving a kind of good starting point in terms of an EV strategy from which all the subsequent deployments can flow. So the first step we would always highlight was I would always highlight would be around setting the vision and objectives. Ultimately, what is the local authority looking to achieve from a particular deployment? Obviously, charge points themselves are just a means to an end. They're a means of encouraging EV uptake within an area, but there's a whole lot more wrapped up within that. So to what extent is the local authority seeking revenues from the deployment, seeking to innovate versus deploy more quickly? What types of sites do they want to bring to market? What kind of sites can they bring to market? So there's a whole host of initial kind of vision and objectives piece to kind of look to define. The next stage would suggest is always then doing some baselining, so understanding where the local authority stands at the moment in terms of existing charge points and existing EV ownership, EV registrations within the local authority area. Where are they? What does that mix look like locally? What's the degree of provision already there? How does that compare to neighbouring areas? As well as looking at the context in terms of local socio-demographics, vehicle ownership trends, and so on, to start to inform and give an evidence base to inform what future requirements might look like. Which suggests that the next stage there is then looking at the local policy context and engaging with stakeholders. And this is a point always really keen to encourage when developing an EV strategy, is really making sure that the team reaches out to all of the various departments and disciplines who have some interest in EVs and EV charging. So it might begin life in the parking team, or in a transport team, or in a sustainability team, or in the estates team, but ultimately, representation from across those different stakeholders internally is really important, as well as then plugging into external stakeholders like the DNO, neighbouring transport authorities, and so on. Beyond that stage then would tend to suggest it's around forecasting. So having done a bit of reflecting and looking at what's the current provision, what's the current makeup of local EV charging requirements, and what's the local context, it's then what's going to happen in the future. So typically forecasting up to at least 2030. Getting beyond that starts to get a little bit precarious, because the level of uncertainty increases quite dramatically, but forecasting up to 2030 then gives you a good basis to then estimate some public charging requirements from that. There's all sorts of ways you can derive those numbers. Obviously, they depend massively on what you assume in terms of the type of charges and the types of location, but plugging in some reasonable assumptions as to what mix might be appropriate then gives you a number to aim at, indicatively at least.
Sorry, Matt, I was just thinking, Matt, on that point. Anthony, you talked about you've got to the point now where you're going to get to 500 sockets or 500 chargers quite quickly. In terms of your piece of work in Islington, have you kind of mapped out what the next sort of 7 years looks like for you, and therefore how many charging points needed? Is that kind of your next step of your strategy, as it were?
The strategy needs refinement. I think we're moving more now towards an action plan, to taking forward what's in that strategy in terms of the overall aims, and to deliver against clear timelines and activities. So quite a number of steps that we mentioned in terms of the engagement with the various groups, including, for example, private hire and taxi and freight. That's something we're doing at the moment to map out what that future will look like.
Yep.
And I guess from our perspective, in one way, we're lucky in that we're part of a fairly dense, compact borough. We have adjoining neighbouring boroughs are pretty well advanced within their charging point strategy as well. So there's a common ground and conversation we're having. We're not too far away from each other in terms of where we are on that delivery. But essentially, that's part of what my job is, particularly as we're looking at thinking about the procurement for the next round beyond March 2023 now. And there's a whole area about what the market's looking like and how the market is changing to be considered as part of that. So whereas the strategy that exists, I think it's one which is fluid in terms of we do need to keep updating it. We do need to reflect what's happening in a number of areas, not least in terms of Department of transport legislation, the accessibility issues that are coming to the fore and people are being consulted on, the actual market operations in terms of procurement, etc. So it'd be great to say it was fixed and we had a trajectory, but we have actually quite a lot of areas that we need to cover, and that's part of the work I'll be doing over the next number of months at least.
It's an incredibly dynamic marketplace, isn't it? Evolving incredibly quickly, and completely sympathise with that need to. It's an evolving piece, isn't it? And it links to the next point I was going to flag in terms of what would suggest is a next step, having done that forecasting of demand and forecasting what the requirement might look like in terms of public charging provision, is then that soft market engagement and really reaching out to the market to understand what's in the pipeline, what are the different models and offerings that charge point operators and other mobility providers, such as car club operators and fleet operators, as you mentioned, taxi and private hire, what is the market doing to respond to this demand, and to what extent is the private sector looking to deliver some of that anyway, and where are they very much not? Where are the harder to deliver bits, maybe commercially less attractive, and then performing a little bit of a gap analysis as to what is the role of the local authority in this mix, and where have they got a more kind of key role to play to make sure that places aren't left behind or underprovided for. I don't know to what extent you've kind of found that so far, and that's kind of part of what you're currently kind of working through.
I think in terms of not just the other operators and what's out there, but in terms of technology change as well. One of the characteristics of the borough here is narrow footways, narrow roads. So we're looking as well, and very interested in looking at what's coming on track and what's coming on the line in terms of concepts such as wireless charging. Simply to be able to manage how we think the future evolves in the borough. We have not got the space for a rollout of very large amounts of equipment on our highway. We have got to manage that space, given the constraints, but also demands upon it. Because one factor we've also looked at it and make sure we're seeing the EV strategy as part of a overall holistic and sustainable transport strategy. We're seeing it as there's a walking, cycling, and public transport use, and yet they all have the same almost level of demand in some roads. So I find myself in a strange position of competing with bike hangers, for example, similar areas. So I think it's far more than just as charging as well. In terms for any authority, it's about how they will be fitting into wider transport strategies, particularly if you've got a transport strategy that's maybe looking at reducing individual vehicle use whilst protecting freight and other operators. And from my perspective, the procurement, the types of equipment sector, that's one part of the strategy. But the bigger question for me right now is how it balances out across what the world wants to do in terms of its overall net zero strategy, which is a stronger active travel and balancing what's needed.
And I think that's again part of the challenge there, Anthony, isn't it? In a world where you've got limited resources and a finite amount of capacity, you've got this much bigger, and rightly so, push towards net zero. How does everything the council needs to do align to that? But also then a microcosm possibly of that is their EV charging strategy. Now, we've just run a poll here online. We'll do another one in a minute. But the first poll we asked was, do you have a completed and approved EV charging strategy? 17% of you said yes, 83% said no. So I guess from that perspective, Anthony, for those 83% that have said no, looking backwards on what you've seen maybe over the last year or the last couple of years, what would be sort of the 2 or 3 things that you would really try and make sure that if you said, actually, if we could do it again, what would you do differently? Or what would be those key nuggets of advice that you give to your colleagues to say, look, if you're starting from scratch, you need to get here. What are those key couple of things? And then same question to you, Matt.
From my perspective, it's the engagement. Right. For us, there's so many things that are happening within Islington in terms of both the borough's transport strategy rollout, but also across what's happening with TfL. We have the regional transport strategy they have, and their charging proposals for main road network. There is the need to accommodate public transport initiatives, taxis, for example, and making sure that stations in the borough which have got taxi ranks, we're looking at those in terms of, so it's that a wide engagement across not just the different departments and teams here, but across into the neighbouring authorities or regional transport authority, plus key users. And that's where it takes the time. That's where it takes the effort as well. So it's the one thing I would say at the front end is understanding what that need is there, not just from the borough perspective, but for those who will be using the roads as well. And I think from that, we did some modelling as well around possible likelihood of what was needed, but it's such a fluid system that it's never going to be answering all the questions. So we've moved, I think, to a sort of a demand and partly plan system. And I would say that from that perspective, from any authority, it's never going to be perfect to start with. It's never going to be absolutely the numbers you want when you want them, when you can deliver them.
Yeah,
it's an evolving fluid situation.
And I think that's part of it, though, Anthony, isn't it? Is you're never going to, because this, as we've said, this is such a dynamic marketplace, because things are moving so quickly, not only the adoption of electric vehicles, but also technology and providers, that, we've had so many conversations with local authorities who said, yes, I wrote my strategy 2 years ago. Yeah, and now I've got to rewrite it because it's moved. The whole world has moved on. And as you said, I think coming back to your point, Matt, it is forward projecting, trying to figure out how many vehicles in your ward, your borough are going to be electric by, let's say, 2030, and draw a line there, and then trying to project out, and then just trying to understand how quickly on that trajectory you're climbing. But equally, Anthony, to your point, how many other factors you have to think about in terms of net zero goals, public, active transport, and how do they all play their part into that? Are we going to see less vehicles on the road? Does that actually mean that you're going to, put in a ULEZ zone or something else of a similar nature? Matt, just coming to your perspective there, so those two sort of key nuggets that you'd give to people who are just on that journey, what would they be from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. So I think one kind of links to some of the points that you've already made, Anthony, and I guess I tend to kind of want to highlight scale and urgency to a certain degree. So I think it's been really interesting over the last few years watching the EV market and EV charging market evolve. And I guess we've kind of gone through the kind of initial round now of relatively smaller scale deployments. And when you start to look at the forecasts uptake curves and the forecast requirement for charging, it's pretty daunting, frankly, that the numbers required in a not too distant future. So I think there's almost a kind of mindset shift needed now to have moved beyond things like small scale pilots and trialing things. There's still a role for that, particularly where innovative kind of solutions are being piloted. But there's a need to your point, Anthony, kind of not kind of overly kind of worry about whether everything's absolutely perfect in terms of exact sites and so on, because there's so many other factors at play anyway, that there is an urgent need now to start planning for deployment, because it takes time to get these in the ground from a standing start, and when you look at the requirements in the future. So I think one is urgency and the second is scale, and that plays to the kind of last of the points I would flag as kind of next steps in terms of strategy, which is having engaged with the market, tested and really challenged the market as to what they can deliver for you, what they're already looking to deliver anyway on a private sector basis, is then to inform tenders to make sure that the tenders that are taken to market are going to be appealing and attract good bids and be deliverable by the private sector. So really kind of listen to and engage with the private sector, challenge chargement operators and related operators, and really see what you can kind of attract in terms of investment to your local authority area, and then finally kind of wrapping all of that up in an action plan that kind of sits at the end of the strategy, to your point, Anthony, where you have pretty tangible kind of lines of actions with task owners, timescales, and that's the thing that is then continually revisited and updated as things fluctuate. And hopefully the kind of front end of the strategy doesn't change too much in terms of the vision and objectives, but the market piece will inevitably evolve, the numbers will evolve, the baseline will evolve, and the action plan should be kind of worked through over time. and new tasks added on as the original ones start to get ticked off. So those would be my 2 points. Consider scale and how you're going to deliver charge points in the medium to longer term, and really look to kind of attract investment into an area and challenge the market, challenge the market, what they can deliver for you and what offers are available.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you both for that. So I think there's we've got the live chat or the ask your question option there. So if you want to ping any questions through, we can certainly pick that up and make it as interactive as possible. I'm just going to end the next poll. So we've had 29 votes on the next poll, and the poll was, what's the greatest barrier to implementing your strategy? So 27% said financing, 7% said human resources, 23% said lack of expertise, 17% said internal politics, and 27% said other. Now, obviously, on the politics front, it's an interesting one that I guess working in local authorities, you know and love. There's probably not so much that we can do. But having said that, we've been in situations over the past where we've helped to write briefing documents to make sure that politics piece is hopefully dealt with in the most expeditious of manners. But actually, when it comes to human resources and lack of expertise, then I think to your point, Matt, that's where where we would advise people leaning into the marketplace, getting expertise from out. There is huge sources of knowledge. Obviously, I'd say Liberty Charge has got a huge amount of expertise in this space, but there is an enormous amount of knowledge and expertise that is out there in the market, and whether that's through the mechanisms that you're talking about, Matt and Antti, in terms of actually engaging through that process, or actually whether you go and more formally appoint somebody to come in and help you through that journey, that I think is a critical factor. What we do spend a lot of time within Liberty Charge trying to act on behalf of local authorities is to try and suggest to central government that you guys need more funding, that you guys need more funding specifically for resources, so that you can have more dedicated resources. And that's one of the things that our local authority survey that we just completed and published has pointed out, is the fact that there is no surprise, critical lack of resource, dedicated resource to drive this. And I guess question for you, Anthony, in terms of that regard specifically, this is, whilst obviously you've got a target in terms of getting to your 500 sockets, it is, for most local authorities, this is a multi-year program, isn't it? It's not a 6-month exercise and you chuck the infrastructure in the ground and you forget about it. Not only have you got to work with those parties to do the planning that Matt was talking about, and then deploy the infrastructure, but you're deploying it generally in batches, and that's over a period of time, and that could be years and years and years. So from your perspective, Anthony, what do you think is the sort of almost a critical minimum resource that you need within a local authority to really drive this through at pace? Is it 1, 2, 3 people, or does that depend on? Or does maybe that's a tough
question. I mean, we have a separate dedicated group dealing with our fleet and the rollout of charge points within council depots and work areas, essentially. I just deal with the on-street work, and essentially that's I'm just the person who does that. There isn't, so the engagement is with the charge point operators, which we have got existing agreements with. Now, in some respects, we've been fortunate in that within London, there's the framework agreement, which TfL had set up and London Council are managing, which allowed us to access resource to deliver fairly easily. It was simply pulling off a framework. With the conclusion of that framework agreement this year, there's a significant new challenge awaiting us, which is to procure from start. Now, I think it's important to think of resource not just in the charge point team, or if there is an officer that you might have, but it's across other parts of the authority, contract management and procurement, for example. But also at some point think ahead about what it means to have 500 charge points on our streets. There's an asset management question coming down the line, probably not as quickly, but it is coming down the line. So when we talk about resources, I'm really going to be interested to see what comes out of the actual the Levi funding in terms of its idea about funding for resourcing. Whether they think in terms of just delivery and just installation, or were they thinking long term about maintenance, along about the engagement that's needed around the contracts, even about making sure that we have a quality of service for users. That if we are working with charge point operators and we're monitoring that quality of service, I think there is more to be said than just about delivery. It's a far wider and more encompassing area. And I think although we started this conversation with strategy, the strategy is not going to pick up all of this, but it's worthwhile if you're looking at EV charging over multi-years to think not just the immediate delivery over multi-years, but have an eye to what that future will look like within your authority, and also what it might imply for that authority.
I think
and it may well be that it can easily fit within current structures and resources, or it may well be there needs to be some thinking about that longer term. So certainly from my perspective right now, I always stress it's just my perspective, that's one of the challenges coming down the line for me, is the additional procurement that's going to be coming next year. So most long term, of course, once we have delivered a large batch of chargers, what happens then?
Yeah,
who's got the ethics?
I think you're absolutely right. I think equally that that talks the point about, you know, what role does the local authority want to play or need to play over that engagement? You know, is it very much a defined plan and, you know, sort of fairly lightweight operation in terms of making sure that you're deploying the right network in the right areas, and most importantly, making sure all those other stakeholders that you talked about, Anthony, internally are aligned and you've solved the internal politics as far as you can. And how much do you then actually push out and use the private sector in terms of not only short-term resource to do your site planning and help through consultation, but also then in terms of what role do you want the private enterprises to actually work through that? Do you want them to do a fully managed solution for you? Matt, when you've had those conversations with local authorities, you know, there's a huge amount of options they need to think through. And as you say, Anthony, you can't put this all in the document. But part of that strategy is I guess what role the local authority want and can play, and what considerations are they thinking about right at the early stages around the different operating models and the different business models that exist in terms of the charge point market.
Exactly that question of what is the local authority's role in terms of EV charging provision has you know, often been at the heart of many of the discussions when putting together the strategy, and often that's a question of being kind of determined through the discussions and analysis that happens as part of that piece of work. You know, resourcing is a part of it. Obviously, that dictates to what extent, you know, they can have a greater role in some elements. But I guess it's to what extent the local authority is looking to have a more kind of involved role throughout the kind of ongoing ownership and operation of the charge points. And we've moved away from that model quite a lot over time now to a more concessionary type model, where the local authority looks to frame their requirements and take that to market for an operator to then deliver and operate and maintain in line with agreed KPIs over a period, to really kind of mean the local authority can principally play a kind of contract management role and check that, you know, they are delivering in line with those requirements, having put in the initial work up front in specifying those as part of the tender, which is why, you know, so much emphasis ends up then going into making sure that what goes to market is going to give the local authority what they want. I'm not sure to what extent, Anthony, that's kind of been the case for you, and you know, that's been kind of your experience.
Indeed, I mean, there's some of the conversation we're having now about the what will that procurement look like in terms of wider sense of the quality and the longer term relationship we have with the charge point operators, as well as social value questions which come up. It's an important aspect for any authority, I think, or for most authorities now. And I don't have answers yet. There isn't an immediate situation where, but it does say that it's probably, the strategy is a foundational document, but it's what you build on that, and that's the headache in many ways, because one can set out a direction of travel, making sure that what's done in the right way, and who you're focused on delivering charge points for, and who needs them and who's going to use them in what way. But it's also thinking about perhaps other social aspects that come through. I mean, one of the aspects of our determination of where we're charge point is to ensure we have equity in terms of a level of rollout, which doesn't mean there are essentially deserts of charge points in some parts of the borough. And you know, it's not uncommon, and certainly in Islington, there are more viable areas from the point of view of charge point operators than others.
Yeah.
And that question is one which will become important as you roll out as well. So I'd actually, you know, it's spot on to talk about that relationship that you will have with the charge point operators to go forward, particularly as the boroughs or the authorities' own aims and objectives will need to be thought about in that.
I think a couple of points you make there are really interesting, and I think you're right. I think the strategy should be looking to embed kind of broad principles. So, you know, a principle being, for example, something like adopting a portfolio approach, where the local authority looks to engage with a charge point operator and require of them that they not only come and kind of cherry pick the best, most commercially attractive, most viable sites across the local authority area, but also as part of that will deliver some of the less commercially attractive, more difficult to deliver sites, and provided that portfolio can be made to work so that the good sites can offset the poor performing sites, it's quite a nice way of achieving exactly what you described there, of that equitable access to charge and provision, which I think as planners is the kind of challenge for us over the next kind of 10 years or so, is to make sure that the ecosystem that we are developing now is fair and equitable, provides good access, doesn't lock in any inequity to anyone, and doesn't accidentally preclude people from charging if particularly mobility requirements, for example. Another kind of principal kind of point that comes to mind is you're kind of talking about what goes in the strategy versus what is a kind of ongoing piece in the action plan. I think is that wider sustainable transport piece. And again, I think that's something that's been quite interesting to see how that's evolved over the past few years, from a point where EVs were, until relatively recently, I would suggest, have always been kind of treated slightly in isolation. Initially because they were just, it's got a niche piece, but then partly because they're different to kind of core transport planning. But I think we are starting to see them now be taken on board with some broader transport planning principles when planning for sustainable transport strategies. So considerations, for example, around, well, do we want to deploy charge points on that street there if there's an aspiration for that street to be pedestrianised or to be de-trafficked in some form, or some bays be removed for cycle parking provision or parklets or something like that. So actually some kind of thought going into, are we kind of locking in car use in some areas by deploying charges in areas where actually we've got other sustainable transport aspirations for those? So I think it's quite interesting seeing that EV charging is starting to be drawn into broader sustainable transport planning, and I think it's timely that that's starting to happen, particularly as we look at the scale that we talked about earlier, the number of charge points going in. I think having to kind of carefully identify, where do we want vehicles to be charging in the future, where do we want vehicles to be in the future? If we don't want vehicles there in the future, then clearly we don't want vehicle chargers to be there in the future. So I think that kind of joined up strategic planning it's got a really important part to play in that sense of establishing those core kind of design principles.
I think just going back to the point that you made there, Anthony, as well, about, you know, not only the role that the local authority and the charge point operator make, and making sure that you have that fully inclusive network, which we totally totally endorse and support. But obviously one of the key or the biggest or the highest weighting, I should say, answer to our question around implementing your strategy is around financing and obviously money. Now, yes, we know the new Levi fund is out there. Still yet to hear, you know, who's got the first tranche in the pilot phasing, and what the second phase will look like, and the timing of that and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see how that sort of flushes out over the next, goodness knows how long that will take. You know, whether that's 6 or 9 months or 12 months before we get clarity around that. But with financing being such a barrier to implementation of strategy, were there certain considerations that you took into, when you went through the process of looking at what your strategy should be and how you go about implementing that?
I think less so in strategy, more in activity in terms of coming out as a result of that. A strategy which is, looks trying to deliver 1,000 was really about the overall target, the overall direction. It was the getting there that was influenced more by the funding availability. And it's fair to say that that's sort of been a little bit of constraint in terms of how fast we can roll out. I think in conversation with charge point operators and with other charge point operators who are interested in expanding into the borough as well, they are thinking in very big terms. They're thinking far bigger terms than perhaps we have the resources to deliver and the finance to deliver at this point. And we have been able to balance that to date. But as you said, the market is moving so quickly, and the demand, that's there and that's coming through, as well as the need to deliver far more in such a short period of time. I mean, we have got to unlock that financial question, and to the extent that we'll be looking at either fully funded models that are coming on stream. Let's look at those and see what the commercial benefits, what the benefits are overall, or whether we are able to unlock funding from OSEV via Levi or continued ORCS funding, for example, allowing us to move forward. I think that's going to be the real decision point for us about the speed at which we can roll out, because there simply isn't going to be the capital funding within the authority to deliver anything like the scale that's required. You would the best will.
I think that's completely our observation as well, and to one of the points I made earlier around, one of the kind of headline challenges and key things to consider within a kind of longer term strategy is the scale point that we touched on. And when you do look at the number of charges required, it's substantial. It's not all that far away, and hence my second point really around challenging the market as to what can the market deliver on a funded basis, and enabling that more scarce funding, the more scarce grant funding that's available, to be really targeted to the areas where without it charging won't be delivered. But equally there are plenty of instances where the private sector could fully fund really quite large numbers of charges in relatively short order to enable kind of that more rapid delivery. So obviously that funding is one of many factors. It's not the only thing, as you said. There's lots of other things to consider, but I certainly kind of encourage local authorities to really challenge the charge point operators in the private sector as to what they can deliver with limited or no funding, and see how far you can get with that, and then kind of selectively dipping into the grant funding as and when it becomes available. And hopefully we should hear, as Neil mentioned shortly, that the pilot round of Levi funding and who's been successful there, and then ultimately the larger pot sometime next year, all being well with budgets being raided and so on, given what's going on at the moment. But
well, I think that's a very apt point, Matt. Is yes, there's a Levi fund there today, but just because there's one there today doesn't necessarily mean that by the time we get a new Prime Minister in place, it'll still be there by the time they've looked at let's be very clear, all of the other crises that we're facing into this winter. I can't imagine that there's going to be any pot that's left unturned by HMT. So I think coming back to your point, Anthony, setting out that strategy in terms of what you're trying to achieve, how quickly, how fast you're trying to get there, what the different models you've considered are, what that network plan looks like, what's that mix between slow, fast and rapid charges is part one. Part two then is then how do you go about implementing that, and choosing the right partner with the right funding model, the right strategy and the right approach, and making sure that they're providing you with the support that you need in that journey, I think is absolutely critical. And to your point, Matt, then making sure that actually that partner either has or being really clear whether that partner has or hasn't got the ability to help fund it, or totally fund it, assuming that government funding either may disappear or even if it doesn't disappear, could be quite challenging to get to. And I think we're going to find, as you say, more about that with the Levi results as that comes through. Now, somebody has asked, they say the question and answer session is open in terms of live chat. Somebody has asked whether Mark Roberts will be coming online. Unfortunately, he's had significant security issues logging into the website, so unfortunately he's not been able to join. So apologies for anyone who's logged in specifically to hear Mark and his perspectives. We'd had a conversation, really good conversation with him last week. He'd come into a new role, and we were hoping he was going to bring some of that insight in. So apologies from Mark's perspective, he's not able to join on that one. But as I say, this is going to be the first of a number of these webinar sessions that we're running. So hopefully we can bring him back into a future one and get him to share some of his insights in that process. So kind of coming back to strategies then, in terms of how we take those forward. So once we've got that strategy locked in and approved and signed off, I guess, and the internal politics sorted, Anthony, and everyone's on the same page in terms of what they're trying to achieve. What would your advice be to local authorities in terms of some of the next steps that they should be thinking about once that strategy is set to go?
If the strategy is set and that has got a level of clear targets or dates to things to achieve, you have a working plan. If you haven't got that, develop one quickly up from the strategy would be my first point, if it isn't in there already. From there, then I think there's a lot of good advice out there as well. There's a lot of other authorities who are taking some of these steps ahead of you, and there's other non-governmental bodies and and those that the actual want of advice, it can be met. So from your particular position, whatever the local authority is, I mean, for me, it's very much different, say, in a compact London borough to maybe a wide-ranging county, rural development. It's actually that specific advice where you can as well. But I found one of the key aspects has been communication with members. It's giving them the confidence that that strategy, which we spent time delivering and working up and preparing the ground for and working with members, is actually something that's happening. It's not just been placed on a shelf somewhere and in hope. So I think if there's anything I would start talking about, it's ensuring that when you are working your way through your strategy in terms of your action points that come out of it, you're communicating throughout. You're communicating back to members, because I think from where I sit, members are very, very supportive because they see things happening. They see the value of what's happening. But I wouldn't necessarily from where I am. It's basically been an ability to build on what we're already doing rather than anything else. The strategy takes us to the next stages of that. So we're able to think more broadly about beyond the current delivery plan, which we keep going with anyway, but it gives us the opportunity to think about wider the models of ownership, for example. So I can't say that there's a one size fits all, but in terms of the strategy that you've delivered, then communicating back its ownership in terms of what's happening with it is key. And there's a feeling
completely echo that from my experience as well. I think securing that buy-in from key internal and external stakeholders, and that's a big part of the strategy, isn't it? As you say, when you get to the action plan and the delivery, that becomes a bit more fluid and has to evolve. But if you can get the kind of buy-in to that initial strategy piece, establish some core principles of what is it we're trying to achieve, what are real kind of core principles for us that we need to enshrine within subsequent tenders or subsequent deployments, get the buy-in from the people who need to be on side with that, and then when you do come to the delivery stage, there shouldn't be anything in there that throws up surprises that can cause people concern or worry about the kind of direction. So yeah, I think a good strategy at its heart is consulting with the right people, getting the right people around the table, virtual or physical, and making sure that what you enshrine within that strategy document is something everyone can get behind.
You're locking in delivery against that, essentially. So you're communicating those key benefits that are being delivered, the key activities that are beating what you want to achieve in terms of those principles and objectives you set out. And I've found that has been a bit of a challenge at times because it does require sort of number crunching and everything else. But I think it's very welcome from the from members here and ward councillors here. Because their communication with residents, their communication with businesses, their communication with is an important strand of how our message is getting out and also what we're getting feedback in. So I would say don't think of the strategy as a document that sits in one place. It is something you're always going to want to be able to communicate back up the line towards the councillors and the executive, but also in terms of be able to utilize their knowledge of their area to influence perhaps any changes or your action plan coming forward. So it's a document that you use in that sense.
I thought something you said there was interesting as well, and kind of reminded me that I guess another key part that we've often seen strategies playing where we've worked on them elsewhere is slightly around a kind of education piece as well, particularly in helping people explain to perhaps to local residents or local businesses why, as a part of the strategy, a particular approach is being taken, and often as part of that, it's necessary to kind of convey the differences and appropriateness of different charging solutions, for example, for different use cases and different locations. So, the EVs and EV charging as a relatively new technology still that is not kind of widely understood by many still. There's still that need, I think, often to help people in understanding what the most suitable type of charger is for a particular use case, for a particular user in a particular location. And again, the strategy can play a bit of a role there in setting out some of that information up front, introducing some key terms and principles before then going on to define the strategy, and helping to secure understanding as well as buy-in from the various stakeholders.
I think as well it helps manage the trade-offs and the compromise that might be made as well. Particularly in our borough, the borough here is covered by CPZs. So there is no place where residents will feel that they're not going to be losing out if you're taking space for EV base. So the strategy, by saying out the higher level of principles, and again, this is where that communication factor works between yourselves and the members, is you're explaining why these trade-offs and balances need to be made, but also how we're going to try and protect as much as possible businesses and residents in that future. Now, and that is of great benefit, I think, to our councillors as well. They're clear about where we're going, where we're going, and why we're going there, and what that implies.
I think interestingly, sorry, go on.
Oh no, I was just simply saying that the benefit of it there as a sort of a document that is laying out the key factors and the key challenges, gives councillors a clear message and gives them the ability to message back to their residents, etc.
We talked a little bit there about the fact that, and Anthony, you picked up the same point, which is, it takes time, not only in terms of the strategy, but actually once you've got the strategy in place, it actually does take a lot of time to go through the next series of steps, which we'll cover in further webinars. But for somebody who's sitting there at the moment without a strategy in place, what do you think is a realistic time frame? And again, it's difficult to pin the tail on this donkey, but have a go. To go from zero strategy to actually having something deployed in the ground, because we know that the government has set themselves a desired time frame of 2030 to get 300,000 charge points in the ground, at least 300 publicly accessible charge points in the ground. That's a scale of close to 10 times what we have today, in less than really 7 years to get there. But if somebody is sitting there today going, I haven't started yet, what's that likely view from zero, no strategy to actually getting something ground? Is it a year, 2 years, 3 years? What's your sort of gut feel?
I think it's interesting because we had started before a strategy. We were trialing some charge points, and anyway, there was a rollout of about, I'd say, 50, 60, that sort of number before the start of a development of a strategy. In terms of my predecessor who started working it, that was about 9 months of work to get to its current position. I think partly because I guess that the politics here is more cohesive than perhaps in other areas, in terms of there was a general desire from the ruling the party that they would want to see this delivered as part of active travel and transport. So we didn't have so much pushback from the politicians at that early stage. They wanted to see something that put this thing in place. So I think nine months has been what we've gotten to. What we're now looking at is this action plan and delivering detail. That's been the heart of it, because that's a moving feast. But it will depend purely. It will depend purely and simply on how your consultation, how wide and deep it has to go. It will depend entirely on the politics. And I do know that, you can be such a change in just a year in an election, for example. That's the key. So, but we were fortunate, I think, in that for us it was fairly smooth, partly because we had run some trials on the ground and they were generally seen to be positive. And I think there is quite a large number of early adopters of EVs in the borough as well, and they were quite vocal in their support. So it seemed to gain a little bit of momentum beforehand. So I'd say 9 months is good, very good. I'd say you're probably talking about, best part of a year, depending on the level of consultation. That would be my thinking, at least.
Great, thank you, Anthony. And from your perspective, Matt, what sort of the ends of the spectrum, if you like, from best practice, which maybe we suggest that's 9 months all the way through to, in certain circumstances you've seen, what's the sort of the variety of timeframes you've been dealing with?
Yeah, well, so for the strategy element specifically, so ignoring kind of any subsequent procurements and deliveries and so on, the strategies, the quickest we delivered were maybe kind of a couple of months, but at the other extreme could be 6 months, could be longer than that. And to Anthony's point, it massively depends on how many people you're engaging with and how extensively you're engaging with them, because obviously it takes time to get stakeholders together. You probably need a couple of workshops, various kind of meetings. If you're trying to engage with a DNO, that takes time. And then maybe a couple of drafts of the final strategy with kind of cabinet reviews and various kind of senior sign-offs. So as I say, in the quickest instances, we kind of put them together in a couple of months. Really, that's when there's been quite a quick coming together on what everyone's looking to achieve, and maybe a bit lighter touch versus some way more involved and getting further into the action plan element, as you were talking about, Anthony, and really kind of starting to kind of distill specific tasks from that as well, assign task owners and starting to flesh those out. So quite a big range in strategy. I mean, I would say, similarly to Anthony's piece, is that the strategy doesn't necessarily need to slow down everything. There is, to a large degree, I think what we've seen across a lot of the country is people deploying the initial charge points, potentially quite small scale, sometimes medium scale maybe, and then retrospectively putting together a strategy looking ahead slightly longer term as to, well, we've got these initial few in the ground, we need a slightly more kind of joined up longer term approach going forwards, and that's what the strategy is going to start to do. So yeah, I wouldn't want the strategy kind of end of things to kind of completely grind delivery to a halt, because as I mentioned at the start, I think there is a need for some urgency around delivery, when we do look at what's needed. But ultimately, you need some kind of strategy and evidence base and reasoning to underpin all of this. So.
And it may well be, and just to add that, it may well be part of your transport strategy. It may just be sitting within it. It's not that there's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a substantial document for every authority. It can be.
That's a really good point. I've seen them range from kind of 100 pages plus to 15, 20 pages or maybe less than that. And I think maybe that is the way things are headed, is that now EVs are no longer a kind of niche activity sitting out on their own. They're starting to be kind of drawn into more core transport strategy documents, which is kind of a natural evolution, I suppose, as it matures as a sector.
Which makes it valuable overall, because if you're linking it back in towards walking or cycling strategy, which may already exist, you're beginning to make those links across a more sustainable transport network and its use. And so you don't have to redo it as part of an EV strategy. locks in.
And maybe to your point there, Matt, the key thing there is that the world of electric vehicles has moved on so significantly over the last, even the last 3 years, but certainly the last 5 years. And maybe there's less of a sale that has to be done internally to talk about why it's needing to happen. I think with momentum in the market generally, hopefully people are much more aware that it needs to happen, and therefore hopefully there's less focus internally of going, this is why we need to do it, and this is actually, the focus is more about less on the why and more about the what and the where. But I think, if I'm just going to close out now, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but from what I've heard today, there are a couple of key things that continue to come up through our conversation. Firstly, about communication, both in terms of inside with your colleagues and peer group, outside in terms of obviously residents and businesses, but also with local authorities who've done this before, and try and learn the lessons from them as well. Because I think, as you say, Anthony, there's lots of valuable experiences that have happened, and people have, good stuff that people have gone through, and I think most people we certainly speak to are very happy to share lessons learnt. Very happy from a Liberty Charge perspective to offer up conversations and equally share with what we've gone through in the past. Second point then I'd make, and kind of picking up on your point, Anthony, is don't go for perfect. The strategy is going to evolve, it's going to change, but get something down there and actually start implementing. To your point, Matt, it's about scale and pace being key. We know we've only got a short amount of time to get there, and it is about thinking about that big picture in terms of what we need to achieve in that short space of time, and making sure that we're building in scale and pace there. I think the fourth thing then is time. It does take a lot longer, to go through all of these steps, everything from the strategy, but then into the deployment, selecting the right partner, and actually then deploying this stuff actually is often the quickest piece of the jigsaw. But all of the other aspects, it can take quite a long time. So if people are sitting there without a strategy and without charging points, definitely look to get moving sooner rather than later. And then I think possibly the last thing there is then there are loads of useful resources, both externally there in the marketplace. Talk to the marketplace, understand what the different suppliers can offer, what experiences and what pros and cons they've been through, and really use that opportunity to engage in the marketplace and understand, how you can take the best of other people's strategies and make them fit for purpose for you. Because at the end of the day, it's great to talk about, somebody from a different city, but actually if you're living in a rural community, if you're working for a county council, you've got different challenges, as you were talking about, Anthony, that you need to think through. How does that integrate with your broader net zero strategy and the other challenges that invariably the local authority is dealing with? So we will be having further sessions in terms of those next steps of the jigsaw that you need to think through in terms of going from that strategy all the way through to the deployment piece. So do make sure you tune into each one, to the further ones of those. But it just leaves me the time to say thank you very much, Anthony and Matt, for your time and your contribution. And to all of those who have been on the chat today, really appreciate you taking the time out to come and join us. There'll be plenty more opportunities to dial into the future sessions, and we're a resource here to be used, so do reach out and have a conversation. But on behalf of everyone else, Matt and Anthony, thank you so much for your time as well. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.